Valerie Jarrett moved to Chicago from abroad at the young age of 6. From the artistic skyscrapers in Chicago to the marble buildings in Washington, D.C., Ms. Jarrett has served as a leader in both the private and public sectors. She worked as Deputy Chief of Staff for Mayor Daley, served as Commissioner of the Department of Planning and Development, acted as Chairwoman of the Chicago Transit Board, and was a member of a number of boards of trustees right here at the University of Chicago. Before joining the White House in 2009, she was the CEO of the Habitat Company. As senior advisor and assistant to the president, she managed several offices while chairing the White House Council on Women and Girls. Ms. Jarrett has dedicated her life to public service as a brilliant strategist and thinker. I moved to the US from abroad at the young age of 3, and I aspired to be a leader in public service. When I look at Valerie Jarrett, at her family, at her achievements, I see inspiration. Ms. Jarrett's grandfather is believed to be the first African-American graduate of MIT and the country's first accredited African-American architect. That's extraordinary and an inspiration. Her mother, Barbara Bowman, an early childhood educator, had a Chicago street named after her. That's close to home, right here in our city, and an inspiration. Her father, a pioneering doctor, was the first African American to be tenured in our very own Division of Biological Sciences. That's really close to home and an inspiration. Ms. Jarrett herself served as the senior advisor to the first African American president. That's history and an inspiration to all the world. I believe that we should be inspired by Ms. Jarrett. We should be inspired by her to be ambitious. We should be inspired by her to be optimistic. We should be inspired by her to believe in the unbelievable and to do the impossible. We should be inspired by Ms. Jarrett to leadership, to responsibility, and to public service. We should be inspired to brilliance. Tonight, our guest will be in conversation with the IOP Executive Director, Gretchen Crosby Sims. Please join me in welcoming former White House Senior Advisor to President Barack Obama and current Senior Fellow at the University of Chicago Law School, Valerie Jarrett.
You did. Thank you.
Isn't that nice?
Thank you.
First, apologies to those of you who thought you were going to see David Axelrod tonight. To those of you who are prospective students, I think this is just a sign that you're going to have to accept and come back. He's at the IOP frequently and sends his regrets tonight, but I am thrilled to be able to stand in. Enya called you an inspiration for so many reasons, and she's not alone in seeing you as such.
Well, I'm hoping she's going to come and introduce me everywhere I go from now on. That was the best introduction I've had in a long time. Thank you, Enya.
We are so privileged in this here at UChicago to consider you family. You went to the lab schools as a child. Your father was a professor here. You have served as vice chair of the Board of Trustees, chair of the Medical Center. You are UChicago, and so you're the perfect person to tell some of our audience, the prospective students, about why this university is so special. We will get to that. And we'll also get to your thoughts on current state of affairs in the US today. But first, I want to take us back and make sure that everybody here understands your extraordinary life story. There was a recent profile of you done that said that Valerie Jarrett comes from one of the most prominent African-American families in American history. That is no small statement, but it's an accurate one. Your great-grandfather was, as Enya said, famed and the first African-American architect. Your grandfather was a housing activist and the first African-American chairman of the Chicago Housing Authority. Your father, a renowned doctor. Your mother, a legend in early childhood education here in Chicago and nationally. So in short, there is clearly a tradition of serious accomplishment in your family and of public service. And I guess the question is, what did your parents impart to you in terms of values? And if Enya is inspired by you, what inspires you?
Well, that's a great question. And I was sitting here thinking, I think the last time I was in Rockefeller Chapel actually was for my father's memorial service. And so it's a little jarring to come back here, but it feels like home because I came here so many times in the course of my life, both as a child and as an adult. And I think what my parents really instilled in me is a sense of unconditional love, high expectations, and a safety net to catch me if ever I came close to falling. And that freed me up to take chances and risks and look at life as an adventure. And I was very fortunate to have that safety net. The other thing that my parents really taught me is just like you teach your 5-year-old to color well within the lines in a coloring book, to color well within the lines when it comes to having a moral compass. And to really be able to think about the fact that lots of people sacrificed in order for me to have the kind of opportunities, Gretchen, that I've had in my life, extraordinary opportunities. Don't mess it up, was kind of the message that my parents gave. So I feel very lucky to have been raised by them, and then they helped me raise my now adult daughter. I was a single mom for most of my daughter's life, and I couldn't have done it without them. My father picked my daughter up every morning and took her to the lab school from the time she was in pre-K until she graduated from high school, and brought her home every single day. And I think the other thing they also taught me is that you have to be reliable, and people are counting on you, and to be steady and consistent, and that your word is your bond, and that your reputation is the most important thing you have.
It's an important set of values. Your father's work took him to Iran when you were a small child. You spent your first few years there and then in London. How did that experience shape you as well?
Well, I was actually born there. So when my father was leaving the military, he was looking for opportunities to join teaching universities around the country. He wanted to do research. And back then, and I'll date myself, that was in the mid-50s. I know it couldn't possibly be that I could have been born in the 50s. I think that all the time. But sadly, it's true. So when he left, he looked for opportunities around the country, and he wasn't able to get a job at a compensation equivalent to his white counterparts at an institution with which he wanted to affiliate. And so he and my mom, who were always kind of these adventuresome spirits, decided to look outside of the United States. And he heard about a posting of an opportunity in Iran. And back then, obviously, those of you who are students of history know that we had a far better relationship with the government of Iran than we certainly do today. And they were very interested, their health department, in bringing physicians from around the world to help start hospitals in parts of Iran that were underserved. And so there was a post available to start a new hospital in Shiraz, Iran, then a small city, now a booming metropolis. And so my parents took a look at each other, and they thought, well, why not? So off they went. Neither of them spoke Farsi. I think the furthest they'd ever been before was Europe on their honeymoon. And all alone, they packed and went off, and my father helped start the Namazi Hospital in Shiraz. He ran the Department of Pathology there. And I was the second baby born in the hospital. They practiced on somebody else for the first baby. And then along came we lived there for 5 years, and then the research that my father did in Iran caught the attention at the University College of London, Galton Laboratory, and so he was recruited to go there. And from there, he caught the eye of the University of Chicago, and ultimately came here in the early 60s. And the University of Chicago Medical Center did a profile on him, I think right before he passed away. And I think the headline was something along the lines of, sometimes the shortest distance to where you want to go is the longest way around. And it was his dream to be affiliated with an institution such as the University of Chicago. And he loved this institution, and it was very good to him, as it was to all of us. My mother received her master's in education here. But if he hadn't taken the leap of faith and gone to Iran and done the kind of unusual research that he did there, he wouldn't have been recruited to London and then back here. So you have to be willing to take those chances. And I think that's the other thing that my dad, particularly when I was young, said, look, you can take a chance. And what's the worst thing that's going to happen? It's not going to work out. You can always go back where you started. But if you want to move forward, be prepared to take a circuitous route. And certainly my career turned out to be circuitous.
Okay, so speaking of, so you were here for elementary school at Lab, speaking Farsi with a British accent, something like that?
Well, actually, when we first moved here, I went to the local public school, Shoesmith Elementary School, which is at 53rd in Dorchester. And I had had a great education in both Iran and in London. And so we arrived here in September. I was 5 years old, and they placed me in 2nd grade. And I showed up for school with a British accent, speaking Farsi, French, and English, oftentimes in one sentence. And here I am, red hair and freckles, and I used to just get beat up all the time. And so within about a week, I lost the British accent completely. I stopped speaking Farsi to my regret. Would have come in handy, I'm sure, at some point in life. And I really tried to just be like everybody else. And I think that that's something that all young people just want to fit in, and I stuck out like a sore thumb. And unfortunately, the education at Shoesmith then was really not what it should be. And I remember in 4th grade, by the time I was in 4th grade, one of my teachers asked several of us to go outside the classroom, and so I assumed we were in trouble. And then I looked at the other students, and I was like, those are the smart kids. And the teacher said, I just want you to know that no matter what I say in the classroom, you all don't have to do any homework. Well, I thought that was great, right? So I go home and I say to my mom, I never have to do homework anymore. And she's like, lab school, here you come. And the beginning of the next school year, I was at lab school. And so that's how I joined the lab school.
You did well. You went off to Stanford. You studied psychology. Was that in your mom's footsteps that you were thinking, or were you sure what you wanted to do? Because you then went to law school. What happened with that path?
All right, so I'll confess to you. So when I was in high school, I developed a real interest in anthropology. And I had a great anthropology professor, and I started studying Jane Goodall. And I really looked up to her and admired her research, and she was at Stanford. And so I really went to Stanford to study with Jane Goodall. Unfortunately, the summer between my senior year of high school and the time college began, there was a raid on her dig, and several of the students were kidnapped. And Jane was able to escape, but they shut down the dig, and she took a few years off. So here I went to Stanford thinking Jane would be there, and she was gone. And I thought I would do human biology, but I was going to wait for her to come and teach it. And then I started taking psychology, and I thought I would be pre-med until I took organic chemistry. Full stop. Well, actually, 2 things. It was the organic chemistry, where I literally didn't understand a word they were talking about. And it was also, I had a boyfriend who was in medical school, and he said, well, you should come to my anatomy class, and that will get you more interested in medicine. It did not. It did not. And so the 2 things happened in the same quarter. And then I really fell in love with psychology. And I had a couple of great professors. And that was how I ended up in psychology. In law school, my best friend was 2 years older than I. And she said, you should go to law school. And my mother said, you're not qualified to do anything else when you first finish. So she was a big believer in education and advanced degrees. And so she said, I don't care what you do, but pick one. And my father said, don't feel any burden to be a doctor, because I'm not pushing you to do that. And she surely didn't push me to be an educator. They said, do what you want to do. And so really, for lack of anything better to come up with, I went to law school. Not necessarily anything I'm proud of, but that's how I started out.
So then you had a corporate law career here in Chicago.
I did.
For a couple of years. And then you went to work for Mayor Harold Washington, the first African-American mayor of Chicago, who was elected 35 years ago today, I think. Why did you make that change? You then stayed in city government. What was it about city government that felt so compelling to you that you chucked the corporate law career?
Well, when I was finishing college, I came up with a 10-year plan. Some of you may have plans already. 10 years was a little aggressive, I think. But I had this plan. I'd go right to law school, and then I would either go to Washington, that was my thought, or come back home. I'm an only child, so I was thinking, well, I might be homesick, I'll come home. Join a law firm if I didn't go into the government, make partner, get married, have a baby, all by 30. That was my plan. And I did come here. I went to a law firm, and then traded up to a better law firm, started doing commercial real estate finance. Boring, very, very boring work I turned out to be. And I married the boy next door, who turned out to not be quite what the boy next door ought to be. And I did have my daughter. She's perfect. That's the one thing I got right in my 20s. But by my early 30s, I was really quite miserable. And I went through a program called Leadership Greater Chicago that had its 35th anniversary last night. And I spoke there about how important that program was to my life, because it just opened me up to the civic life in Chicago. And one of the real advantages of the city of Chicago, I think, is that it has such a strong civic commitment by the business community. Business leaders here really care about the fabric of our city and work hard to try to make it better. And this leadership program exposed me to politicians and business leaders and the cultural institutions and the suburbs, somewhere I had never been when growing up here. No one ever went, let alone to the north side, let alone the suburbs. And it just opened me up really in a very important and profound way. And then a friend of mine had worked for Mayor Harold Washington and for his first term. And the mayor had just been reelected to his second term. And my friend said, "You are miserable." And he was going back to his law firm. And he said, "Look, you can always go back to a law firm. Why don't you be a part of something bigger than yourself, more important than yourself, where you can give back to the city that you love so much?" And so I took this leap of faith and I joined the administration thinking, all right, 6 months, it'll buy me some time to figure out what I want to do. 8 years and 3 jobs later, I left.
And during that time, you were a single mom raising your daughter.
I was.
Who not only is perfect, but clearly thinks you're perfect too. She called right before we were coming on stage, and I got to see that amazing bond in action. But what was that like, and how did that experience, it's not easy being a working mom. I can only imagine what it was like to be a single working mom. How did that experience shape your thinking and what eventually became your pretty strong leadership on women's issues and gender equity?
Yeah, well, Gretchen, pretty profoundly, because I knew how hard it was for me to be a single mom. And here I had, as I mentioned, these doting grandparents who were right in the same neighborhood, who would babysit her my dad's trips back and forth to school. I was a lawyer, so I had means. I had 4 months paid maternity leave. I always worked for employers, particularly after I left the law firm, that appreciated the fact that my daughter came first. It didn't mean I didn't work really hard. I did. I've always worked hard. But if something came up with her, then that had to be my priority, because if I didn't show up, nobody would be there. And I think part of what I always counsel people, and we just had a session with some young students where I was saying is, do not, when you go for an interview, just simply sell yourself. You really have to figure out whether your life circumstances are going to fit in the place that you select. And you have to be honest with yourself first, and then you have to be honest with your employer. And so I've had the good fortune of always working in institutions where the fact that I was a single mom was embraced. In fact, I tell this story all the time about meeting with Mayor Daley when I was freshly appointed to the Commissioner of Planning and Development, and I was terrified of him. He was a really scary guy back then. He's probably still a little scary. And I was looking at my watch during a meeting, and so was my good friend who was a corporation counsel, Susan Schur, who actually works at the university again here. And we kept looking at our watches, and finally he said, "Well, why are you looking at your watches?" And in a moment of truth, I said, "Well, the Halloween parade starts at the lab school in 20 minutes, and we're 25 minutes away." And my daughter was going to be a little pumpkin, and if I wasn't there to see her, no one was going to see her. And Mayor Daley said, "Well, then go." And the relief I felt to know that he appreciated that being a mom was really important to me. And we rushed down here and next door at the lab school, and my daughter came out looking for me in the crowd, and thank goodness I was there. Yeah. And so I feel as though I was one of the fortunate ones, but if you were to have asked me 25 years ago, I would say I was holding on by my fingertips. And so if I was holding on by my fingertips, imagine what working women who are on a shift and their employers don't care whether or not their parent is sick or their child is sick or they're sick, and they don't have benefits or the appropriate insurance, and they're in a horrible bind. And that's really where my passion came from, to make sure that every young girl grows up in a world where she gets that fair shot. And far too many women today still don't get that fair shot I believe they deserve, and I want to fight for them.
I want to come back to that in a minute, but at some point we have to. So you met the Obamas at some point in this story. There's sort of a famous story about how you met them. We want to share that briefly for folks, and then we'll talk about your ride with them.
Well, certainly. So when Mayor Daley promoted me to Deputy Chief of Staff, part of my responsibility was to staff up our office because it was a new position. And Susan Scher, the same Susan Scher, wrote me a note when she was Corporation Counsel, and it said, "Brilliant young lawyer, you should meet her. She doesn't want to be in a law firm, thinks it's deadly, wants to give back to public service." And I thought, my kind of person, I want to meet that woman. Well, her name was Michelle Robinson. And I interviewed her, and she bowled me away. And as I said, she started interviewing me, and I couldn't answer all her questions. And I kind of fumbled my way for an hour and a half. And at the end, I said, "Look, we'd love for you to come. Will you accept the job offer I'm giving you?" Now, I didn't have any authority to give her a job offer, but I was just caught up in the moment. And so a few days later, we were talking, and I said, "Well, so are you going to come and join me?" And so she said, "I don't think so." She said, "I talked it over with my fiance. He doesn't think it's such a great idea. You didn't do a great job of answering all my questions. I couldn't explain them to him. Would you be willing to have dinner with us?" So I'm like, "Well, first of all, who is your fiance? And why are we caring so much what he thinks?" So she said, "Well, his name is Barack Obama, and this is 1991, so he's fresh out of law school." And she said he started his career before law school as a community organizer. And he really is worried that if I'm going from a law firm right into the fire, not even the frying pan, but the fire in the mayor's office, am I going to be prepared, and who's going to be looking out for me? And so he wants to know and get to know that person. And so we had dinner, and it was the most extraordinary dinner, because normally when you meet people, they say, "Well, where are you from?" And I always say, "Chicago, I grew up here." And he goes, "Is this where you were born?" And I always hesitate, because then, I say Iran, and you get this reaction. People go, "Oh my God, what were you doing there?" And instead of doing that, he kind of leaned in and he said, "Well, tell me why." He was curious. And he really got me to open up, and we talked about what we learned with me spending formative time in Iran and him in Indonesia, and the perspective it gave us on the world and the United States. And we concluded a few things in common that really, I think, provided the foundation of our friendship. One, that we feel we can walk in a room and talk to anybody. Because as kids, we were used to talking to people from all over the world, and who spoke different languages, and that you could still figure out how to play, even if you didn't share a common language. The second thing we learned is that to appreciate the United States in a way that people who've only lived here might not. So everything from the water we drink, to the food that we eat, to our civil liberties and rights and privileges of free speech, are not shared the world over. And when you live in a country that doesn't have many of those benefits, you appreciate them a little bit more when you do. And then the final thing we learned was that the United States is the greatest country on earth. It is not the only country on earth. And that you can learn a great deal outside of our shores if you're open and you listen. And we talked about that conversation a lot over the years, and it really formulated our bond. And then similarly, Michelle Robinson and I talked about our parents, and we were both lucky to have parents who loved each other and were these supportive, nurturing role models, and embraced our sense of adventure and taught us how to be unselfish in our love. And so that was my bond with her.
So you had a tight bond with both of them, colleagues, friends, and as things progressed, Senator Obama decided to run for president. You were a close advisor. You helped on the campaign, and then you spent 8 years in the White House. What were the early years like? You walked in, financial crisis,
Oh my
2
gosh.
wars,
Yes.
hostile Congress. What did that feel like? What was that like?
Well, it was really hard. And some of you may be too young, the prospective students, to remember, but we were losing 750, 800,000 jobs a month. The banking industry was on the brink of collapse, which was going to send shockwaves through not just the big banks, but community banks. Millions of people were losing their homes. I mentioned the people losing their jobs. The automobile industry, which Chicago has a good piece of, but certainly next door in Detroit and Ohio, lots of automobile jobs. Two of the three big car manufacturers were in bankruptcy or on the brink. 2 wars, dependence on foreign oil, a crisis in terms of our reputation globally. We had a lot going on. And the challenge was to try to right the ship and move forward an affirmative agenda. And that's part of the challenge of leadership, is you have to multitask. And people would often say, well, how did you decide? How did you do 2 things at once? Well, you have different teams who do different things. And we had really, I think, some of the smartest people on earth come in and really tackle those challenges head on. And as time went on, I often remark that the smartest people, I think, turned into a really sturdy team. And it takes a minute to build a team. Many of you who have started your own business or come in and tried to reshape a team, it takes a minute, and you have to get to know each other's strengths and weaknesses and see how people respond under pressure. And my goodness, we were under scrutiny, and between the kind of the people who had made up their minds that their goal was to make sure that President Obama didn't get reelected, to appropriate scrutiny by the media, to social media, which is good news and not accurate news all wrapped up into one. There was a lot going on. And this is where I think I'd take a moment to talk about President Obama's leadership skills, which were really nerves of steel. And sometimes people think, well, he's just a nice guy, but he has a terrific demeanor and temperament, I think, for that job. But he's also capable of making really hard decisions after he's fully informed. And he spent a lot of time listening to people, particularly those with whom he disagreed, really closely, to make sure that his thinking was as informed as it could be. And he surrounded himself with a diverse and inclusive group of people, because different perspectives make you think as much as you should before you make the most important decisions of any human being on earth. And so it was an extraordinary 8 years. And I wouldn't have traded the privilege and the experience for anything on earth. But that first term was really hard. Not that the second term was easy, it's all hard. But you do develop a rhythm after you get a team around you with which you're very comfortable.
You worked on a range of policy issues for 8 years. What do you think of as the accomplishment you're proudest of?
Well, there are so many. I suppose, I'll tell you a story. It's one of my favorite stories about President Obama, and it gets to the answer to your question, Gretchen. So the night that the Affordable Care Act passed, we knew that we had the votes to pass it, because we're from Chicago and we count our votes early. That's kind of what we do here. So I went home. And again, Susan Scher, my buddy, was now doing healthcare legal work in the White House. And so we lived across the hall from each other. We stayed dearest friends to this day. And we literally got in our pajamas and made a bowl of popcorn to watch the vote. And we turn on the television and the phone rings. And it's President Obama's assistant, Katie Johnson. And Katie said, Valerie, President Obama would like to invite everybody who worked on the Affordable Care Act back to the White House for the vote. And I said, oh, Katie, that's really sweet, but Susan and I, we're in our PJs, got the popcorn, TV's on, we're good. And Katie said, Valerie, President Obama would like to invite everybody who worked on the Affordable Care Act. So I look at Susan and I said, oh, that's right, he is our boss, we have to go, right? So we get dressed, and fortunately we only live like 10 minutes away. We schlep back to the White House, we watch the vote, and then he invites everybody upstairs to the residence to celebrate. And Mrs. Obama was out of town, which is the only way he got away with this impromptu party for 100 people. And the folks on the staff were screwing around looking for champagne and pigs in a blanket, I think they served. Had probably been in the freezer for a while. And it was an unseasonably warm evening, similar to election night here in Chicago. And those of you who are from Chicago, November never has, 60 and 70 degree weather. I should probably not say that to the prospective students, but it's like full disclosure here, it gets cold early. So then this was spring, and it was the same thing. It was beautiful weather. We were out on the Truman balcony at about 1:30 in the morning, and nearly everybody had left. And I sidled up to him and I said, "You look so happy." And he had spoken to my most junior staff person who was responsible for finding people who would benefit from what we were proposing, to the vice president and everyone in between. And he walked up to her and he gave her a big hug, and she'd never met him before. And she was like, "Oh my goodness." And he's like, "Thank you so much. By finding the people who are going to benefit, we were able to tell a story, and the story helped us get the bill passed." And she was just, to this day, we'll never forget that moment. And so I sidled up to him and I said, "You are so happy. How does how you feel tonight compare to how we all felt election night?" And I'll never forget this. He looked at me and he said, "Valerie, there's no comparison." I said, "Election night was all about getting to tonight." And to me, that's why you go into public service, because you're there in service of people. You're trying to help them. And so the fact that under our watch, 20+ million people were able to have health care, many for the first time. Young people, such as many of you, can stay on your parents' insurance until you're 26. No one can be discriminated against because of a pre-existing condition. There are incentives for people to get primary care. And I see Holly sitting here, and my goodness, when I chaired the medical center board, our emergency room was inundated with people who would have had far better care if they had been seen on a regular basis by a primary care physician and received continuity of care. And so I appreciated just all of the different elements of that plan. So we don't know what will happen with it going forward, but every day that people have insurance who didn't have it before, I consider it to be a great day.
So apparently does the audience. So that's one of the highs. There were other highs. There were other things you guys got done across a range of issues. The Trump administration is undermining or rolling back a number of those reforms on Affordable Care Act or climate or immigration and DACA.
You're killing me.
Sorry. So my question was, how do you feel about this? My question was, how that must be incredibly disheartening, and how do you, having worked so hard and gotten those wins, and blood, sweat, tears, and a lot more went into them, how do you look at them now and think about your 8 years and your blood, sweat, and tears?
Well, see, it was never about us. And so I signed up to work really hard. I love the country. It was an incredible honor. And when we had the baton, we did the best we could. Elections have consequences, and that's why we actively campaigned to try to continue many of the initiatives that President Obama had put in place. 8 years goes by amazingly quickly, and it's not enough time to really solidify everything, which is why you want to make sure the person who follows you believes in what you believed in. But I think that the people to ask that question to would not be me. It would be the DACA kids who are scared to death about whether or not they're going to get deported, or the single mom who's worried about her job, or the person who does have a pre-existing condition who's worried that when you don't have a mandate, are you going to be able to afford covering people with pre-existing conditions? And so what troubles me as I travel around the country is how many people are really worried and scared who are going to benefit from many of the policies and legislation and regulations that we put in place. I mean, take something like climate. I believe in science. I think we should all believe in science, and we are contributing to the demise of our planet. And the fact that every country practically in the world signed a climate agreement, and that we are left out of that, is really troubling to me. And if we don't lead, we're going to fall behind. But I also take the long view. And our democracy has never been easy. It's always had periods of chaos. And I'm old enough to remember when other bad things happened in our country. I still remember when JFK was assassinated, and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. I remember when Nixon left office. I remember a lot of really tough times, the civil rights era. People describe it through the lens of 50 years hence, but I remember what it was like when a church in Birmingham was bombed and 4 little girls died, or when people walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and were hosed and stoned down. So I say this, and my daughter, by the way, says this is not helpful when I do this. At age 32, she said, stop saying that to me. That doesn't help. But I want people to appreciate over the arc of our democracy, it has been at its best when citizens are engaged and involved. And 43% of eligible voters did not vote in the last election. I actually believe we should have mandatory voting for everybody. Everybody. But in the absence of it being mandatory, and that doesn't mean that everyone shouldn't still do it. And so I have been heartened, for example, by the young students in Parkland. And not just them, but what they have catalyzed across the country. And the fact that so many people not only came out for a march, but are now planning to go to town halls and hold their elected officials accountable. I always say that the problem, well, not the problem, one of the problems in Washington is that the special interests do have a stranglehold because they carry purse strings. But the mighty, mighty force that will always win is you. And when you decide that you're going to show up, then a state like Florida, that is with a governor who has an A+ rating from the NRA probably, changes the law in just a matter of weeks. Really big things happen when citizens get involved. And so I think that in a sense, a sleeping giant has been awakened, and that's you. And I encourage people to get engaged. And we always say, you know, sometimes it feels like for a presidential election, if there's an inspirational figure, then everybody gets out and votes. And when I say everybody, still young people don't vote. And I don't know why. You might knock on doors, but you don't vote. You got to vote as well. And people think that their vote doesn't count. But we looked at, you know, districts in the 2009 election where President Obama won by just a few votes. I mean, every single vote matters. And so I say that what gives me hope to get through this period of darkness is truly you, and the fact that citizens are getting involved and are getting engaged and are asking questions of their elected representatives. And if you don't ask questions, then they'll take that check from the NRA and they'll do what they want to do. And I don't want to just single out the NRA. There are lots of special interest groups that spend a lot of money supporting elected officials. And the only counter for that is citizen engagement.
Another area where we're seeing a lot of activism besides guns is on sexual harassment and Me Too and Time's Up. And you've been very vocal in sort of welcoming the change in the conversation and hopefully in the action that we're seeing on this. I guess I wonder, where do you think this is going? Do you think that this is going to be, and what do you hope it will be, is it going to be a change in awareness and norms, and sort of people are going to change their thinking around it, or are we going to get to a point where sexual harassment in the workplace is going to be, you know, we're going to be seeing legal action, and courts are going to be taking the lead on it, or Congress is going to be taking the lead, or state houses are going to be taking the lead in actually doing more than just changing norms? And I'm just sort of wondering, where do you hope that goes?
Well, I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and. And I mentioned Time's Up, where we're raising money to help women who can't afford lawyers and are being harassed in the workplace and need somebody who's their advocate because they're at risk of being fired or penalized by objecting. And so we want to give them the support that they need. And so we're going to really work hard to do that. I believe that we should have a whole range of checks and balances in place to ensure that people are protected, all people are protected in the workplace. But I think what will be sustainable over time isn't just having laws that provide those protections, but changing, as you said, norms, Gretchen, but it's culture. It's culture. And I mean, and I've seen it happen, and it happens slowly but surely, and it happens usually on the ground. I'll give you the perfect example. I was with a group of very young people the other day, and I was talking about same-sex marriage. And when President Obama took office, it was legal in 2 states. 2 states. In 6 years, because of the hard work of people who had been working for decades. It went from 2 to 37 states in the District of Columbia. And then the Supreme Court ruled it was constitutional nationwide. And I think that it would have been harder for the Supreme Court to make that decision when it was only legal in 2 states. I think the progress we made state by state by state indicated that the social norms had changed and our country had evolved. And it gave them some wiggle room to do what I think was the constitutional right thing to do. And that's what courts do. That's why we could go from a Plessy versus Ferguson, and then you could go to a Brown versus the Board of Education. The Supreme Court changed its mind based on social norms. And so my hope is that we get to the place where it is unacceptable to harass people in the workplace, but that's not it. I also think we have to get to the place where women and men earn the same pay. Women still only earn 80 cents on the dollar. Women of color, less. I think we should get to the place where everybody has paid leave. Men and women should have paid leave. Men and women should have parental leave. I don't know why we have a difference between maternal and paternal. I want men to be as involved in their children's lives as women are. I think we have to have paid sick days. We have something like over 40 million Americans in our country who don't have a single paid sick day. Well, how can you possibly, first of all, everybody gets sick, right? And if I'm in a restaurant, I would like to think that the people who are working hard in the kitchen can take a day off when they're sick. Otherwise, you end up like David Axelrod, who's not here today because he's sick. We won't go into how sick, but just take it from me.
Really
he's sick. He's really sick. So I think there's a whole basket of issues that I call working family issues, and that employers who want to be competitive in this 21st century workplace, where the goal is to both attract and retain the most talented people you can. Now that women comprise half the workforce, we are graduating from college at higher rates than men, graduate school even higher rates. So the pipeline is there, but if you take a field like computer science, women stay an average of 3 years, and the #1 reason they give for leaving is culture. So it is in the enlightened self-interest of employers to approach this from how do I keep talent, and recognize that diversity is a strength, that you will make better decisions, as I was saying a few moments ago about President Obama, if you're surrounded by people with different life experiences, including gender and race and sexual orientation and geography. And I think that's the direction we're going. But we're going to push it, and we need all of your help pushing it as well, and looking at the implicit biases. We all have biases. I mean, it's not like you can separate us from society, but the key is to look at them and try to change them and try to be better.
I want to take student questions, so if you want to start lining up, I've got one more question, but if we want to have some students start to come to the microphone in the center. My last question before we turn to the students is, what can young women themselves do? What do you wish that you had realized or known at the beginning of your career? And the spoiler alert is that you're, of course, writing a book on this. So as you're working through the advice
Buy my book. You'll get all the advice you need there.
What 2 or 3 pieces of advice would you give young women today, particularly those who might be considering a career in politics or public service, going out? 2 or 3 pieces of advice, things you wish you'd known.
Well, first of all, I will say this about public service, and this is my blatant pitch to get as many of you as possible at some point in your life, if not your whole career, to join public service. Because as I think about my career, I've now spent about half of it in the public sector, half of it in the private sector. And truthfully, my absolute worst days in the public sector, and I've had some bad days, were better than my best days in the private sector. And that's just me. And so part of what I say to young people is you've got to do your own gut check. And you've got to ask yourself, what do you feel passionately about? And it's not like you're going to enjoy every single day at work, but you should feel good about what you're doing and with whom you're doing it. You should affiliate yourself with institutions that share your values, that will allow you to be who you are. You shouldn't have to lie about who you are, who you love, where you worship, any of that, where you work. And particularly to those of you in this room who have so many choices. Be like Michelle Robinson was, and be discerning, and go where you're liable to thrive. And I also say, listen to the quiet voice inside of you. I knew I was miserable when everybody else was telling me I had a great job and a great life. And it's a quiet voice sometimes, but listen to it, because nobody knows you better than you know yourself. And the other thing, which maybe seems contrary to that, but also let yourself change your mind. Don't be so rigid and wedded to your 10-year plan that you can't see a wonderful opportunity like my dad had, right staring you in the face. And as he would say, when one door closes, another door opens, if you have your eyes open and you see it. So that's just a little bit of it. But the final thing I would say, because I do want to get to the students, is that life should be an adventure. It really, it should be like a roller coaster, and there are going to be some ups and there are going to be some downs. And if you live long enough, then you have the good fortune, hopefully, of more ups than downs. But you can't be afraid of failing. And some people don't try hard things because they're afraid of failing. One last story, because this is my tease to David since he's not here today. We were grappling with a particularly thorny issue in the Oval Office one day. I don't even remember what it was, but every day it was something. And we were all throwing out ideas, and President Obama said, well, why don't you all ever bring me the easy ideas? And we said, oh, we take care of the easy things. We don't bother you with those. We bring you the hard ideas or the hard problems. And so we kept talking about it a little bit further. And President Obama said something to which David responded, well, sir, hard things are hard. And President Obama said, I pay you for that advice? Really? And so when David left the administration, he bought President Obama a plaque that he put on his desk that said, hard things are hard, and he kept it on his desk for the rest of the administration. So yes, hard things are hard, but push yourself outside that comfort zone and know that, particularly those of you who are affiliated with this incredible institution, that you have a safety net of a great education underneath you that will catch you. And if you aren't fortunate enough to have parents like mine, a good education is your ticket to resilience. And laugh, particularly at yourself.
Very good advice.
You still have to buy the book because there's more in it than that. That was your tease for the book.
Okay, how about our first question?
Ms. Jarrett, thank you so much for being here. My name is Richard. I'm a third-year political science major in the college. I think it's great that you mentioned hard things being hard. And it brings to mind the 2016 presidential election. It saw many people voicing their concerns with the way things are, the status quo, a lot of disaffected voters. Minority turnout, particularly for the Democratic Party, was down. Are there any specific institutional reforms you think that should be made for the Democrats? The DNC is lagging in fundraising. What more could Democrats do to really recapture the spirit that President Obama was really able to promote for minority voters moving forward, so that we don't just have to wait for the tides to turn, say in 2018, we can kind of sustain the turnout, we can sustain the sense of pride in being a Democrat that many voters no longer have?
Well, first of all, I think that we have to have a big tent. And I think Tom Perez, who's head of the DNC, is in the business of building a big tent. And we have to welcome everyone. I mean, one of the reasons why President Obama won is that he had independents and Republicans who voted for him. So we can't ignore the fact that we have to appeal broadly in this country that is so close in terms of party. And so you can't just rely on Democrats alone. You've got to include and be inclusive. So that's step number one. I'm very supportive of the efforts that Eric Holder has underway for redistricting. We do not have adequate representation in our country right now. We do need to redistrict, which means you have to vote for your state representatives, because that's who draws those lines. And as you saw just recently, Eric Holder sued Wisconsin and was successful. And he's going to continue. He's suing the Trump administration over the census. We have to pay attention to how our votes are counted. And that's another thing I think we have to do. And the other thing I think we have to do is not be quite so hard on ourselves. I mean, when, this is just a small example, but when we looked at the polling of the Affordable Care Act early on, and it was underwater, part of the reason it was underwater is because there were Democrats who thought we hadn't gone far enough. They wanted the public option. Well, you know what? Of course, everybody, well, I shouldn't say that. A lot of people didn't want the public option. I wanted the public option. I thought it would have been great. We could have had Medicare for all. We couldn't get that passed. And so you can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And politics, whether we like it or not, is about compromise. Now, do you compromise your character and your integrity and your core values? No. But do you say 20 million people with health care is better than saying I only want the public option? I say yes. And so I think we have to also do some soul searching, just as the Republicans do, to say, are we so rigid in what it means to be a real Democrat that we don't allow more people to come into our tent?
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, my name is Sophia Michelle. I'm a prospective student from New York, and
Welcome. We hope you join us.
thanks. And I was wondering, since the world of politics is very chaotic, what keeps you grounded in all of it? Like, what values do you hold close to your heart?
That's such a good question. I suppose the key value is you have to be a force for good, which means that I can't slip down into just being against something. I have to stay being for something. And I also have to be realistic about what can I do. I mean, I find it very unproductive to complain a lot about what somebody else is doing when I can't control what they're doing. And I think this also comes with age, is that you change what you can change. And as long as every day I'm out there fighting the good fight and trying to make the world a little more civil, a little more equal, give more opportunity. I mean, we haven't talked at all about criminal justice reform. We have a very unjust criminal justice system, and I spent a lot of time on that as well. So I think that keeps me grounded. And I try to think about the ordinary people across our country who get up every single day and they go to work, and they often have a humble job, and they barely make ends meet, and they have the ability to stay positive and to hope that they're preparing their children to do better than they. And that's kind of what the American dream was all about, is you work hard every day and you sacrifice so that your kids can do better. And those folks who I've had the privilege of meeting as I've traveled all around this great country, they keep me very optimistic. And those who, I mean, I'll give you a short story that Gretchen knows. Today I visited a program here in Chicago called LIFT. And it helps women, particularly women of color, who are just struggling and barely making ends meet. And I met a young woman who raised her children, and now she's raising her grandchildren because her daughter had twins that both are autistic, 5-year-old twins and a 7-year-old. And her daughter just abandoned them and left them with the mom. And what did she talk to me about? How she wants to work at LIFT to help other women who are struggling. And she said, because of the demands of my grandchildren, I can probably only work about 6 to 10 hours a week right now, and I'm volunteering. And the other women around the table told me that they were in the program because this woman made time. Well, if a grandmother who's raising 2 autistic children and another grandchild and is struggling financially to make ends meet can give back to her community, well, that should inspire us all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Yang, second year in sociology. Thank you for coming back home.
Thank you.
I'm really interested in the interval between what we can read from Obama's 2 memoirs, Dreams from My Father and The Audacity of Hope. Obviously, you played a huge role leading to Obama's Senate victory. And the question is, you hired Michelle Obama, and by a force of nature, you swept the 2 young lawyers under your wing. But what are some of the challenges working for President Obama when you transition from this mentor-like friend to an employee, which means a structure wherein between you and the Obamas, There might be a lot of other people. And in general terms, how should a long-time personal relationship jibe with a functional role in the White House?
Such a good question. I get asked this oftentimes, like how do you be both? How do you be a friend and a mentor and then an employee, right? And an advisor. And I think now that I have time to reflect back on the time we spent together, that I think I was a better friend because I was his advisor. So what I mean by that is, if we had dinner at night, I know what happened during his day because I was there all day long with him. If he was struggling with some thorny problem, and the biggest challenges for him were decisions about putting our young men and women in harm's way. Those decisions weighed on him gravely. And so if we were sitting around the table and other friends were there and they didn't know what he'd been through in the course of the day, I was able to be a better friend because I did know. I think I was also a better advisor because I was a friend. And because of the stage of life that I was in when I joined his administration, I wasn't looking for my next job. I was only there to serve him and our country and to just give him the best advice that I could. And because I know he loves me unconditionally, he can't get rid of me as his friend. And so, and if I were to disagree with him, he knew that it was me just telling him what I think. And the kind of manager he was is that he wanted people to be honest with him. And because I knew that that's what he wanted, I could set an example for other people, particularly in the beginning before people got to know him. You find the higher you go, the fewer people there are who will actually tell you the truth. Because they think you really know all the answers, or they're intimidated by you, or whatever else the psychology is. And so I would go in a meeting and I'd say what I thought. And respectfully, because he was the president of the United States, but this is what I think. And then it encouraged other people to do the same. And then we trusted that having run a good process, he would make the right decision. And I think because of that bond of trust that we have, it made the transition work better. I will say to you that I did say to him when he first offered me the job, I said, you know, I've spent the first couple of decades of our friendship where I'm like the boss of you. And now you're telling me that you're going to be the boss of me. And he said, yes, but I'm also going to be the president of the United States. And so I think you can come and do that. And it was incredible. I will say that because of our closeness, when he was attacked in ways that I thought were not warranted, which were most of the time, it hurt. And so I had to learn to control my emotions more so than if I hadn't had a prior long-standing relationship with both he and his wife. And the same thing applies to her. Whenever she was criticized, I mean, I felt it deeply and profoundly and had to work to not let my emotions show to them because my job was to be strong. But it hurt me whenever they got hurt.
Thank you.
Good question. Oh, one last thing on that question, but you can come on up, because this is important in terms of management. And there were people who thought perhaps I had an unfair advantage because we were friends. And because I would have dinner with them, you know, was I relitigating decisions that were being made? And I think over time what people grew to understand and appreciate was that, first of all, he didn't want to talk about work, nor did I when we were having dinner. Does anybody really want to go home and talk about the struggles of the day? You might vent for a minute and then you're done, and you go to children and family and movies and gossip, just like everybody else. But the other thing is that in order for his team to work the way he wanted it to work, he believed we should have our conversation in the room, all together. And the way all of his chiefs of staff operated is that we would meet privately without him first, discuss with senior advisors, write memos, and this is kind of an interesting management strategy, whoever had the pen on the strategy, so let's say it was an issue coming out of the Domestic Policy Council, the head of the domestic policy would write a memo, circulate it to the senior staff. We could all edit it, propose edits to it. We could all add our names to it if we wanted to associate ourselves with it. If in the end the person who had the pen disagreed with our edits, then that person was responsible for including in the memo, well, Valerie thinks this and Axe thinks Y, so that the president would read a memo with either a united position or with differing opinions, and then he could either make a decision on the memo or he could invite us in and we'd have a conversation. And then when the decision was made, that was that. And so there was no litigating outside of that process. And if I had done that, then I wouldn't be a respected member of the team and I wouldn't have been serving him right. But I'll be honest with you, in the beginning, people were suspicious. And I looked at it as my responsibility to win them over and convince them that I really, even though I had a unique relationship, I valued being a part of the team. Yes.
Oh, cool. Hi, I'm Devin. I'm also a prospective student. I'm from Eastern Pennsylvania. And like you, when you were young, I think I want to be pre-med, except my English teacher would yell at me because she's like, Devin, you hate science. But so I don't know what I'm doing. But so I want to be an English major, and I really love to read. So I always like to ask everyone, what are your favorite books? Because I feel like that tells a lot about a person. I just really and obviously I'll steal the books and read them. But so.
Well, I will tell you a book that I reread recently was Team of Rivals, because I was curious. Those of you who haven't read it, I commend you to read it. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote it, and it was really about Lincoln and how he managed and surrounded himself with people who didn't necessarily all agree. And I think we did not have a team of rivals, and there were people who thought when President Obama invited then Senator Clinton to be in his cabinet, that would create this dynamic. And that's not what we did at all. But I was curious to read it to see whether I thought it applied now. I don't still think it applies now. But it's a fascinating history lesson that I would commend anyone to read. Anyone particularly who's interested in politics and how government works and how presidents surround themselves by people who help them make decisions.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
First, I would like to thank you for your excellent job in the Obama administration.
Thank you.
Being a public
My new
servant.
best friend.
My name is Emmanuel Mwako. I'm a prospective student at the University of Chicago from Saxe, Texas, small town, irrelevant.
What's it near?
Huh?
It's relevant. What's it near?
Dallas, I think, yeah. But
Okay.
as a student, I'm worried about the current situation with regard to education in this country. With regard to certain appointments leaving a grim future for our nation's children, what do you think should be done with regard to how to restructure education within this country, specific to inner city education like what we're seeing in Chicago right now?
Yes, well, it's interesting. My understanding is that the scores of the children in the public schools here are actually getting better. But we have a gross discrepancy in how much we spend per child in Chicago compared to the suburbs, both public schools. So we're not talking about the lap school, we're talking about public schools. And so I think we need to reconsider how we fund our public schools. And when it's done based on real estate taxes, you're going to have this discrepancy. I always say there's nothing wrong with the children, it's the adults. And when you ask a teacher to teach a class with 30 kids in a class, and you've combined kids who have special learning disabilities with kids who don't, and they're trying to manage that, and there are no social workers, and there are no other infrastructure to support some of the children who are coming out of the most vulnerable neighborhoods in Chicago. You have to recognize you can't ask the teacher to do everything. We need to build a safety net around the teacher. We need to build a safety net around the students. And one of the policies that I promoted when we were in the White House working with Arne Duncan was to reduce the number of suspensions and expulsions from school, because that is a direct pipeline to the juvenile justice system. We need to keep our young people in the classroom. But yet you can't ask a teacher who has 30 students to keep a disruptive kid in the classroom. So where are her tools? Where is the social worker who can try to figure out, why is this child so disruptive? Is the child hungry? Is the child not getting enough sleep? Is the child traumatized because of gunfire outside their window? And that takes a lot of money and intervention. And my theory is that until we're prepared to realize that the only way that we're going to create a level playing field is to actually create a level playing field, you're going to end up with this disconnect. I would pay teachers considerably more money than they currently make. They are responsible for the future of our country, and yet they're so grossly underpaid and under-resourced. But, and I love the fact that you applauded that, money doesn't grow on trees. And so Vice President Biden often says you can tell a lot about a politician's values by looking at their budget. And I think that's true. And I think the budgets of our cities and our states and the federal government need to reflect better the core values and priorities, which means we're going to have to reprioritize or we're going to have to pay more. And I think that there are lots of ways that we could help reprioritize to reflect the fact that it is, again, just as I was saying, it's in businesses' self-interest to care about a workplace where the culture is healthy. It's in all of our self-interest to make sure that our children grow up in a world where they don't have to resort to a life of violence, that they can get a job and a good education. And it starts with early childhood education, to which my mother devoted her entire life. And you look at the outcomes of people who benefit from an early childhood education, but you can't stop there, or else you get diminishing returns. So it's investment, and it's providing resources, and it's recognizing that our young people are our best tool that we have for the future. And so let's make it a best tool possible. But you should definitely enjoy this institution. That's my view.
I do. Thank you.
Thank you.
And on that note, I want to just say, if your mission has been to be a force for good, you clearly have been for our country, for our city, for this university. We're incredibly grateful to you for coming and joining us this evening, and you stand as a stellar example of the kind of public service and political engagement that we believe our country needs, that we at the IOP try to encourage. And on that note, for those of you prospective students here, we are having an open house tomorrow morning from 9 to 11 if you'd like to come by and learn more about the Institute. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much to Valerie Jarrett for joining us this evening.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.